We're now going to move on to our keynote speaker for this evening. Could you please make her very welcome? She is the Research Director at Jumbunna Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology in Sydney. Please put your hands together for Professor Larissa Behrendt.
Thank you. I'd also like to pay my respects to country and thank the community here for always making me feel so welcome when I come to Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the Minister, her speech, and also Aunty Muriel Bamblett, who's not just a leader in Victoria on these issues, but a great Aboriginal leader around the country and has been a trailblazer for Aboriginal women like me. I feel very humble when I'm around her. It is also a privilege to be here tonight at an event like this that acknowledges such important work. I think one of the most dangerous things about violence against women is that it often happens in intimate settings, in homes, behind closed doors, and undeniably, the perpetrators of violence against women rely on the fact that their abuse cannot be seen and that outsiders will be reluctant to get involved. It's part of their armoury of cowardice. So this event, I think, is so important because it's about the actions that can break that silence, and it's about speaking truths. So I'm going to say a few things about the Aboriginal community that I live and work in that I think are often difficult to say but need to be said. The violence against women, especially alcohol-fuelled violence in our community, is well documented, and the unacceptably high rate at which Aboriginal women appear as victims of all kinds of violence, physical, sexual, emotional and psychological, is well laid out in the statistics with so many stories that go to make them up that it becomes really unacceptable. In the past, there have been cases where violence against Aboriginal women, particularly by Aboriginal men, was excused as part of cultural practice, cases where defendants sought to rely on what they called a cultural defence. And judges who in those days lessened sentences because the offender claimed a cultural right or because they reasoned that rape did not mean the same thing for Aboriginal women as it might for other women, were shamed, particularly by Aboriginal women. And the judiciary, to its great credit, has sought to redress those misunderstandings of what traditional culture means and how it should be treated in sentencing. And while the judicial education in this area, I think, has vastly improved, changing the attitudes of men and sometimes women within our community who think that violence is part of traditional culture remains a really great challenge. Aboriginal traditional culture did not accept violence against women as a norm. So many of you will be aware that our culture was very much around the concept of men's business and women's business, but whereas within a lot of Western cultures, the separate status of women meant a subordinate place, that wasn't necessarily the case in Aboriginal culture. Like many cultures, we were the primary preparers of food. Aboriginal women in traditional cultures were responsible for 80% of the food collection. One almost suspects they sent the men off to hunt so they wouldn't get in the way. But women also played a very important role spiritually in life. They chose where you were conceived and where you were born, and those places would be your link to your spirit world. And in my culture of the Ualarai and Gamilaroi people, our creation spirit was a female spirit. So in our culture, God was a woman. But the reality today, the cultures that we're dealing with today, is that as the power and respect that was given to women in traditional society was eroded, acceptance of misogyny, violence and subordination has increased. I've been involved in a 3-year research project at UTS looking at 6 communities in New South Wales. 3 have high crime rates and 3 have low crime rates. And if I was to articulate for you in the simplest terms what the difference is between those 2 types of Aboriginal communities, I would describe it like this. In the communities where there is a high crime rate and you ask people what they're doing about a complex social issue like school attendance, people will say, well, we've talked to the principal, but he's racist. The P&C don't get on with the Aboriginal community. We went to the local council, but they said this isn't their problem. And none of the shops in town employ Aboriginal people, so what's the point? If you ask the same question in the communities that have a low crime rate, you'll get answers like, well, if the kids don't turn up at school, the principal calls Auntie Beryl, she gets the bus, she goes down to the riverbank because that's where the kids go, she puts them in the bus and she takes them to school. So in the communities where there's a low crime rate, there are people who see a problem and do not question for a moment that they have the ability to change their circumstances and solve it. And in the communities that are dysfunctional, people see those same problems and believe that there's absolutely nothing they can do to change their circumstances. And to me, between those two communities, you see people who are self-determining and people who are not. And it's not surprising that the majority of those communities where things are actually working, those people who get in the school bus are the Auntie Beryls, they are the women. Violence against women becomes tolerated and part of the culture of the community when the traditional moral authority of Aboriginal women is undermined. The social fabric begins to unravel and social problems and all the associated dilemmas become part of the scourge of the community. So I don't have the quick answers for how you provide the fixes to the communities where the social fabric has unravelled, but I know that one of the answers will lie in re-empowering women. And I also think that where we have those communities that are strong and healthy, that often don't get the attention because they don't make the headlines because there isn't the same sort of crisis there. In those communities, we need to preserve that moral authority and respect that women, especially older women, have. And I'm going to turn from my oldest living culture in the world to a slightly newer culture of Latin and just say the phrase that that I want to talk about, which is qui tacit consentire. In this much newer language than Aboriginal. This very important language, which we weave through a lot of our legal work and sometimes uses a bit of a joke, means that silence implies consent. But I think that this idea at its heart has an important reminder about the deadly enemy that silence can be, especially to those who need protection, who need help, who need to be empowered to change the circumstances of their lives. And I think with the privileged positions that many of us are in now, wherever we started our journey, we have an obligation to give voice to those who are struggling to be heard. I think that many of us who have had the chance to work with survivors of violence feel it's not so much of an obligation, but actually a privilege. I often work on cases that have a tough chance of winning. It's the nature of working in Aboriginal affairs, I think. But over the last couple of years, I've been working with 3 families who are all victims of crime. Their 3 children were murdered in an Aboriginal community in northern New South Wales by a white man. And one of the reasons why their cases have never been successfully prosecuted is because at the time that the children were murdered, which was 23 years ago now, at the time of the Royal Commission, so a lot's changed, but at that time the police treated the disappearance of these 3 children, 2 were 16, 1 was 4 years old, as though the kids had gone walkabout. So important evidence wasn't found and it's been impossible to fix that problem. So as I've worked with the families in trying to get their day in court again, I've often been aware of the odds stacked against them, and I've said that to them, that there's a very slim chance that we'll get the justice of that day in court. And it's always been, I guess, humbling for me to hear them say when I tell them that they know the system's stacked against them, but they say, what we really need is just for people to hear our story. And it's an important reminder that often the most important thing we can give someone who's been marginalised or disadvantaged or disempowered is their own voice. Stories are so much more powerful than statistics, and as a lawyer I'm reluctant to say it, but they can be much more powerful than eloquent legal arguments. And I sometimes think we understand that nothing will be more powerful than the hearing of somebody's own words when we actually hear the words in those powerful voices. I know in terms of the story I was just telling you about with those families, as much as I can advocate for them, there's nothing that expresses the tragedy of the situation than hearing a parent talk about what the loss of a child means. And I don't think there's any way in which you can translate that more powerfully than to hearing it in somebody's own words. Those powerful stories not only raise awareness, they overcome ignorance, indifference and complacency, and they do change the environments in which things like violence is tolerated and normalised. The The extent to which communities come to accept and tolerate violence against women is assisted by entrenched attitudes of misogyny and sexism. Violence becomes normalised partly because women are seen as inferior, not worthy of protection, not entitled to dignity and other fundamental rights. And tackling entrenched societal prejudices can seem insurmountable, but it's not impossible. And if we look at a similar comparison, I think we can look at how far we've gone from where we've been to eradicating racism and racial intolerance. Of course, we've still got an enormous way to go, but there's no doubt the long way we've come from. And if we look at some of the significant milestones, we can look at important legal cases like Mabo. We can look at perhaps the very important government reports, the important statistical correlations of things like the Bringing Them Home report. But I think if you look at the things that have most changed the hearts and minds of Australians, you can look at something as simple as rabbit-proof fence. And with all of those government reports and quite divisive legal arguments, because they are about law and not about human story, they pale in comparison to the power of seeing 3 young girls walking through a desert because their desire to get home is so strong. That captures the cruelty of a policy. That captures the arrogance of an underlying racism much more powerfully than any government report or any legal case will do. So changing hearts and minds to effect real social change is a long-term and ongoing and evolving aspiration. And I think what's wonderful about what we're celebrating here are the many powerful voices who've taken us just that one step further towards that goal, a community that has zero tolerance of violence, especially against women and children. And the work being done here tonight that we are celebrating really does have the potential to create social change through powerful images and powerful stories. But I think the real thing that we celebrate tonight is bravery. It's the hardest thing in the world to speak out, and it does not follow that because you speak out about injustice that you get rewarded. In fact, a society that's infiltrated with misogyny will always work against women who want to speak out, and there are many who feel inherently threatened by the voices of strong women. So to all the people who are honoured here tonight for their work and their bravery, I want to congratulate you. The awards are a wonderful recognition, but they're also a symbol of the potential to fundamentally change the world and make it a better place. Thank you.